Thank you, Corey, and thanks for the invitation to speak and the warm introduction, even if somewhat exaggerated. This is kind of a special chance for me, and so the lecture's a little bit different than what I would give to many audiences because it's part personal history and part scientific history and part science. So I'm going to try to combine those things, and I hope that will work out. I want to start with this picture, which some of my colleagues have seen before. This is 1972, and I am in that picture, but nobody would recognize me, except a few people who actually knew me when I was that age. And I just want to mention that Winston and Burl Churchill are in the audience here today. And this is the summer that I met them. And they've been a very important part of my life since then. I was brought out here by a professor at Yale named Elwyn Simons, who influenced many, many people. And some of my oldest friends are in this picture with me. So that was the summer that turned me into a paleontologist. I then reappeared a few years later with a fellow grad student to measure stratigraphic sections in the Bighorn Basin. And my background was entirely in biology, and I didn't know very much geology. And I learned how to measure rocks and get thicknesses of strata with Dave Shankler, with whom I'm pictured here. So that was important for my career. And I also learned another thing, which was how to get vehicles really stuck in creeks. That's Winston and Burl's Land Rover, 1963 Land Rover. And I learned how to get other vehicles stuck the same, well, that was maybe the next summer, and then I bought my own vehicle and learned how to get that stuck. And I just want to say to Winston and Burl right now is that I was not trying to get stuck. Even though you ended up saving me many times, that was not what I was trying to do. I'm not sure why it took me so long to figure out how to avoid getting stuck. So after those experiences, I was in grad school, and I learned a lot about how to collect fossil plants and how to interpret the sediments that that contained those fossil plants from Leo Hickey, who was my doctoral advisor. He was at the Smithsonian at the time that I was a grad student, and then I was at Yale, he was at the Smithsonian, and then we switched places a few years later. And then there was a period of time in the early part of my career when I was just starting out at the Smithsonian, where I was essentially coming out here every summer. I was collecting plant fossils, I was doing more stratigraphic work, and that was the focus. I was kind of in an exploration phase, so I wasn't really acting the way I think a mature scientist would act, where I had a strong hypothesis about what I was going to find. I was more just exploring what was out there because it seemed like there were an awful lot of fossils in the Bighorn Basin, and not that many people had worked on them. So then we're up to 1989. And in 1989, this gentleman here, Philip Gingrich, who was a professor at the University of Michigan, and whose house I stayed at last night in Powell, I might add, had been working in the northern part of the Bighorn Basin for, oh my gosh, maybe 15 years or so, or longer, and collecting mammalian faunas in the Willwood Formation and across the Paleocene-Eocene boundary, which is recognized in these, I'm going to use this. So the Clark-Forkian land mammal age and the Wasatchian land mammal age. And it had been known for 100 years that the mammals down here were different than the mammals up here. But no one had realized, because they hadn't collected enough fossils yet, just how rapid that transition was. And so Philip was working here at the end of Polecat Bench in these bright red beds, and he put together all of the information he had from lower down in the Paleocene and higher up in the Eocene. And this is just a graph that represents something about the composition of those fauna. So what species are present, what groups of fossil mammals are present. And these bright red beds here coincided with the first primates and the first odd-toed ungulates, the relatives of horses and tapirs and rhinos, and the first even-toed ungulates, the relatives of sheep and cows and things like that. So this is a really important change in the composition of faunas in North America. And what Philip realized was that the change from this is meters of section, so we're talking about stratigraphy, but the shift in composition was extremely rapid. So that's a strange thing, and that was interesting to a lot of people, but nobody really knew why it was so fast. So the year after that, there was a paper that was, or this is 2 years later, I guess, 1991, there was a paper published that was describing the results of a drilling expedition of the JOIDES Resolution, which is the U.S. Drilling ship for the ocean drilling program. And they were drilling in the Weddell Sea, so they were like 500 miles off the coast of Antarctica, very far south. They're dodging big icebergs in order to do this drilling. And they're making cores of the bottom of the ocean. And these are three of the scientists who were on board. Ellen Thomas is a specialist in a group of organisms called benthic foraminifera, which is a mouthful. Benthic foraminifera are relatives of amoebae, so they're single-celled organisms, but they make a shell out of calcium carbonate or limestone. And they occur by the millions in very tiny amounts of ocean floor sediment, in these sort of chalky sediments that accumulate at the bottom of the ocean. And what Ellen was doing was, when you're drilling on a ship like that, you need to know where you are in real time. So they're sending the core barrel down, they're coring, and they need to know how far down in time are we. And so scientists like Ellen are able to take a small sample of the core and say, this is 63 million years ago, or this is the late Paleocene, or whatever designation they give it, but they can recognize from in a few minutes or an hour how old the sediments are. And so she was logging these sediments and taking samples, and it had been known for a number of years that there was a big extinction in these benthic foraminifera that live at the bottom of the ocean, these little single-celled organisms, and that if you looked at the Eocene, you had a different group of species than if you looked at the Paleocene. But no one had known how sudden that extinction was. And what she saw was from one sample to the next sample in the same core barrel that all those species disappeared. So suddenly this went from being a piece of information that was kind of, somewhere, there's a couple million years there, we don't really know how fast it happens. It went to being, it's between this sample and the next sample in one core, and there's no evidence that there's a hiatus or a pause in sedimentation in that core. So that got the attention of the people, the geochemists who were on board, and Lowell Stott, who is a student of Jim Kennett's, were both paleooceanographers interested in the history of how the oceans have changed through time. And they went back and started to sample those cores to look at the ratio of two isotopes of two different elements, oxygen isotope ratio and the carbon isotope ratio. And this is not going to turn into a chemistry lecture, I promise, but this is kind of an important point. So there's stable isotopes. These are not the things that make radioactive things radioactive. These are stable. And they have a ratio, and the heavy isotope in the case of oxygen is you get these shifts in the oxygen isotope ratio that reflect the temperature of the water that the benthic forams are making their shells from. And in the carbon isotope ratio, you're getting information about the release of carbon, how carbon is cycling through the oceans and the atmosphere. And what they noticed when they put the samples in a mass spectrometer was that there was this shift in oxygen isotope ratio that suggested that the water at the bottom of the Antarctic Ocean had warmed by about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, that's almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit, in a period of time that they estimated was about 5,000 or 6,000 years. So imagine, that's hard to do, right? Because you're at the bottom of the ocean. This is a very sudden event. And at the same time, they noticed that there was a shift in the carbon isotope ratio that suggested that there had been a big release of carbon into the ocean and atmosphere system. So they thought this was at the end, near the end of the Paleocene, not quite the end of the Paleocene, because it turned out in retrospect that the people working in marine realm and the people working in terrestrial fossils were actually had different time. When they said Paleocene-Eocene boundary, they meant something different. And that was actually cleared up the next year by another study done in the Bighorn Basin. So Philip teamed up with Jim Zakos and Paul Koch, and they did a study, again, right out here in San Cooley area, looking at the carbon isotope ratios in mammal teeth and in little tiny nodules that form in soils. And why were they doing that? Well, the reason they were doing it was because they had this idea that if the carbon isotope composition of the ocean and the atmosphere, they have to change together because carbon cycles from the atmosphere to the ocean and back to the atmosphere. And so they were looking for a known long-term change in the carbon isotope ratio of the atmosphere and the ocean that happens from the late Paleocene into the early Eocene. And they were looking for it in the composition of the tooth enamel. So plants photosynthesize from the atmosphere, animals eat plants. The carbon that the animals use to make their bodies comes from plants, which get it from the atmosphere. We're all familiar with that process. And it basically, if the carbon isotope of the atmosphere changes, it changes the carbon isotope composition of the plants, which changes the carbon isotope composition of the animals, which shows up in their fossil tooth enamel, which is a pretty amazing thing if you think about it, all that sort of tracing through. And it also shows up in the carbon isotope composition of these nodules that form in the paleosols. So they made these measurements, and they saw this interval and Philip had given them samples from that special place at the end of Polecat Bench where he had seen that fauna that was really different, and they went, aha, that's actually the same few thousand-year period that had been just measured the year before in the core from off Antarctica. So suddenly this event is no longer, it's not just a shift in the ocean, some kind of ocean circulation change. It's actually a change that's happening at exactly the same time on land. So now we have a global event. And that got really interesting because all over the planet, there are geologists going, wait a minute, we don't know about anything like this having happened before. Some sort of global shift that's changing the climate, it's changing ocean circulation, it's changing mammalian faunas. It's really a big deal. So I'm now going to sort of briefly flash forward. What do we know about this event? It became called the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM, and sort of the briefest outline, what do we know about it today? It happened about 56 million years ago. Some people would say, no, it happened 55.93 million years ago. And they might be right. But it's a very geologically short-lived event. In a few thousand years, you get this gigantic amount of carbon released into the atmosphere and the ocean, and it increases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, increases the amount of CO2 dissolved in the ocean. And when I say gigantic amount, there's a range of estimates, but it's believed to be something like the size of the total fossil fuel reservoir on Earth today. So it's a lot of carbon. Temperature rises about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Globally, the oceans become acidified by this release of carbon, and they're just really profound changes, as you've just seen, in both marine and terrestrial ecosystems, and the effects of that release last for about 100,000 years. So it is a big deal, and the 30 years of research that have been done confirm that it is. And of course, you're going to want to know why. What happened? This is a little bit uncomfortable because 30 years on, there's still a lot that we don't know about exactly what happened. But the prime suspect is that the North Atlantic Ocean was opening up at this point, and also the Iceland hotspot, which is not shown here, but sort of would have been in about this position just along the east coast of Greenland. These are the sites of a massive amount of volcanism. And by the way, we would have been over here at that point. And that volcanism is thought to have intruded into ocean floor sediments that were really rich in organic matter. These are the same sediments that are the source for North Sea oil, which is a major oil reservoir. So you're in the North Atlantic. You've got these volcanic intrusions being injected into very organic rich sediment, and it's blowing craters in the bottom of the ocean, and through which a lot of carbon dioxide and methane are being released. And since, in the last 5 years or so, several of these craters have been drilled with coring expeditions like the one I described from the Weddell Sea, and we have found now that there are sediments of very earliest Eocene age filling these craters. So there's actually some evidence that this is timed. Some of these craters are timed very precisely with the event, the PETM event. That release of carbon would have caused global warming, and this is somewhat speculative, but it's believed that the climate warming itself sets off other reservoirs of organic carbon. So there may have been permafrost in Antarctica. It's the only part of the planet that would have been cold enough at that time to support permafrost. There may have been fires in areas where there were peat and coal, shallowly buried coal accumulations. And then there are also some strange methane ice deposits that occur in the bottom of the ocean, and those might have been destabilized by the warming of the ocean. So these would have fed back and released more carbon, which would have caused more warming. So you can imagine that sort of vicious cycle would have increased the amount of carbon released and also the amount of climate warming. So that's kind of where we are today with this. And this is now a modern, well, at least just a few years old, history of how the planet's temperature has changed for the last 66 million years. And this is that PETM event. So you can see this is the history of the temperature of the deep ocean, and it's actually expressed here in difference from today. This is in degrees Celsius, so almost twice each, 2 degrees Fahrenheit per degree Celsius. So you can see this is this is definitely the biggest, sharpest temperature change in the entire record. And you can also see just how much warmer it is than today. We're talking about a very different kind of planet. And then you can also see that the whole history of the Earth during this period from 66 to about 35 million years ago, it's too warm for there to be polar ice caps. So this kind of puts this in a context. And over here you can see we're looking at projections of the future and different pathways that we might take depending on how much carbon is released in the next few centuries. So this kind of puts the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum in context, in geological context, and also the future, which we'll come back to at the end. All right, so let's go back to the personal history part of this. There's this paper. It says there's a global event. It's right in the middle of the sections I've been working on since I was a student, and I didn't know about it. I mean, I had never seen any evidence for it. And that was really strange to me because we all know plants are very sensitive to climate change, right? I mean, if you go to Florida, you do not see sagebrush in Florida, and you do not see palm trees in the Bighorn Basin unless they're indoors. So plants are famous for being sensitive to climate, and yet I've been collecting through these stratigraphic sections in the Paleocene and in the Eocene since I was a child, and I had never seen any evidence for this massive climate change that was supposed to happen right in the middle of those sections. So I started to search for that change, like where was it? And I started in 1993 in earnest, and these are just kind of snapshots of different places that I was looking around the Bighorn Basin. I knew this was the best place in the world to look for this, and I still couldn't find it. And this last one is 2002, and it really wasn't until 2005 that I found them. So there was a considerable period of time there where it was a good thing I was enjoying collecting plant fossils from I just couldn't find it. I knew where the PETM was in the strata. I just couldn't find plant fossils in that narrow band. It turns out to be about 30 to 45 meters of sediment in most places in the Bighorn Basin. And that sounds like a lot, but it's not a very rich interval for plant fossils. And then, so I was, this is June 30th. I don't remember anything about the day at all. This is my field notebook from that day. And it just says jackpot, which is about all I could manage to write. It was a late afternoon. I had one student with me, and we were trying to get back to the truck because we'd run out of water, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I think it was about 100 degrees, as it often is, and I started to shovel into a little place on a hillside, and out popped a whole bunch of these very small leaflets of bean plants, and I had never seen them before, even though I'd been collecting for so long. And I knew instantly, it's the only time in my entire career that I've actually had a eureka moment, and it is sort of recorded by that word. And because, you ordinarily, if you find something that you don't understand it. But in this case, I've been looking for so long that I actually did kind of understand the context, and this is exactly the kind of thing I was looking for, was a complete change in the flora, but I just hadn't been able to find it. So this was the day that I found it. A very exciting day. There were a lot of really beautiful leaf fossils here, some of those little bean leaflets. There are a lot of other kinds of plants at that site. And that has basically been my strategy since 2005, is to try to find more places like this. So I'm not very imaginative in that way. I just keep looking. And these are leaves that we found about 5 days ago up here in the northern part of the Bighorn Basin, also in this PETM interval. So there's some more beans. This is a different kind of bean fossil. I don't even know what that is yet. But we keep finding new things, and we keep finding kind of a reinforcement of the same patterns that were established back in 2005. This is a really, really different time for plants. So that's what I want to talk about that next. We've by now got a really nice stratigraphic and paleontological framework for the Bighorn Basin. These green diamonds are plant localities, the black circles are fossil mammal localities. There are thousands of them, and they're all tied together by major stratigraphic sections so that we know what their relative elevations are in stratigraphy. And there's one up here in the northern part of the basin, another one that goes through McCullough Peaks, another one that goes that's west of Basin and Grable, another one that goes from south of Basin out to the upper 15-mile creek drainage, and then we've also been working down here in the southeastern Bighorn Basin. So the Bighorn Basin is truly a paradise if you're a paleontologist interested in this time period. And we've been able to tie together these stratigraphic sections using reversals of the Earth's magnetic field. I won't go into that, but these are basically timelines that tie together the different stratigraphic sections. And there are a few places where we have volcanic ashes that can be dated radiometrically, so we actually know pretty precisely how old they are. And that allows you to take localities that are in different parts of the Bighorn Basin in different stratigraphic section and make some simple assumptions about how time relates to stratigraphy. You put them all in a time framework, and then you have one big data set that you can use to understand change. And that's what's done here. This is I'm just totaling up the number of plant fossil sites I have, and now the PETM is sort of put in this the local context here. These are the different stratigraphic sections, but by now we have a lot of information. So what have we learned? Well, this is a diagram that just plots the temporal range, the time range of different kinds of leaf fossils through the last part of the Paleocene and into the early part of the Eocene. And so each line represents a kind of leaf, and the dots represent times when they are actually known to occur. So we have a fossil of that species from someplace in the Bighorn Basin. And I've grouped the ranges in a way that I hope emphasizes a pattern. So these that are bounded by the blue box are types of leaves that they're known from the Paleocene, but they don't occur they basically never occur after the Paleocene. Some of them seem to go out a little bit earlier than the end of the Paleocene, but that could be a problem with sampling. So these are things that may have gone extinct at the end of the Paleocene in the Bighorn Basin, and they're indicated here in blue. There's another group of plants that are only found in the PETM. So we have lots of localities in the Paleocene, lots of localities in the Eocene, but their ranges in time are confined to the PETM. There are a small number of species that sort of go right through, and then there's a slightly larger number of species that are never found in the Paleocene, but they are found either late in the PETM or in the Eocene right after the PETM. And then finally, there's a group of species in this purple color that are known from both the Paleocene and the Eocene, but I never find them in the now 20 or so sites that are present in this heart of the PETM, the warmest time. So that's a very striking pattern. Some extinction, a lot of immigration, some more immigration that seems to be happening mostly after the event, and then a bunch of things that they're just missing at that time. We just never find them. Where do they go? How do they get through? So just to give you some pretty pictures of fossil leaves and a sense of what kind of plants I'm talking about, some of the ones that go extinct are dogwood relatives. These are a couple of examples of those. Who whose range actually has a gap there in the PETM. So they're present before and after, but not during. These are a couple of different types of sycamores. Some of these may be familiar if you've lived in, say, eastern North America. These are temperate types of trees. There are birches and oaks also extirpated, locally gone during the event. There's this thing which is called Japanese scholar tree. It only lives in East Asia today. Same with ginkgo, an East Asian plant today, and dawn redwood, also an East Asian plant today, but the same climate zone as Eastern North America, basically. So they also are wiped out during this event, but then they come back afterward. Who shows up during the event? It is beans. So that first ecstatic jackpot day was borne out by subsequent collecting. This is just 5 different kinds of bean leaflets and 3 different kinds of bean fruits. So that's it suddenly becomes a very diverse group during the PETM. And that's really interesting because as we're identifying some of these below the family level, so now we're trying to tie some of them to living genera of plants, we're finding that they are mostly tropical trees, and many of them prefer drier tropical climates. So this is the genus Copaifera. It's all over South America and the Caribbean, Central America. This is what one of the modern species looks like. And it's a very, the genus has a lot of species, but some of which are in dry and some of which are in wet tropical climates. One of the most interesting to me is this kind of bean called Arcoa. There's only one living species of Arcoa. It lives on the island of Hispaniola in the dry tropical forest there. This is called Gyrocarpus. It's a tropical member of the laurel family with big winged fruits like this. And this is what a modern Gyrocarpus looks like, remarkably similar to the fossil form. And there it is living with a bunch of cactus in southern Mexico, losing its leaves in the dry season. And here's a CT scan of a fossil seed in the pawpaw family, another tropical kind of plant. So there's kind of an exotic group of tropical trees that comes in during the PETM. Who comes in afterwards? So these are the Eocene immigrants that start to filter into the Bighorn Basin either very late in the PETM or after it's over. This one's in the mallow family, a distant relative of the linden. This is an alder. This is a wingnut or walnut family called Platycaria, which is an East Asian plant today, but the family is very common in the temperate zone, and this is a climbing fern called Lygodium. So these are the plants that come in when the event has concluded or is nearly over. And they also have temperate relatives today. So that story really was fascinating to me. We've got the evidence for a huge change in the flora here during this global warming event, and it's pretty much exactly what you'd expect. A bunch of plants that prefer cooler, moister climates are eliminated. A bunch of plants that prefer hot, dry, or hot, wet climates show up here, and then when the event is over, the hot, dry plants go away, and some of the cool, wet ones come back, and that made a lot of sense. But I wanted to try to get more information about the flora, and the leaves were still too far and few between to really make as good a story as I wanted. So I began collaborating with Vera Kourasides, who's at the University of Melbourne in Australia, who comes all the way to the Bighorn Basin because she recognizes it's also the best place in the world, even when you're half the world away, to study this event. And she's been working on fossil pollen grains, which are much more numerous than fossil leaves. So here's some pictures of fossil palm pollen from the Bighorn Basin during this time period. And so she constructed a diagram very similar to the one I showed you, except this one's flipped 90 degrees, so time is now running this way, and here are the ranges of different kinds of pollen fossils, and here's the Paleocene, the PETM in the red and orange color, and then the Eocene here, and you can see just by eye that there's sort of a similar pattern of the ones that don't make it, the ones that come during the warmest time, some that go through, and then some that sort of filter in as the event is fading, and then a bunch that are found only very rarely during the event or not at all. So the pollen story, many more specimens. I mean, there were, within a couple of years of starting this project, she had 10,000 specimens to look at because it's easy to get lots of fossil pollen. And there was also a pattern if we looked at the living relatives of the pollen grains. When we were in the Paleocene, you can assign the living relatives to different modern biomes. And in the Paleocene, there are relatively relatively low percent of the flora with tropical living relatives, a large number with temperate living relatives, and here are the ones that have living relatives that live in colder climates. During the PETM, that shifts. So you lose the colder climate relatives, you keep the temperate ones about the same, and the tropical plants become a much bigger part of the flora, and then afterwards you kind of shift back again. So the pollen evidence really tended to confirm what we were seeing with the leaf fossils, but with many, many more specimens. So what explains this, or what do we think is going on sort of at a global scale? Well, here we are in the Bighorn Basin. This is now a geographic reconstruction for PETM time, but looking down on the North Pole, you'll notice right away that there's no ice in this area. So we have open ocean at the North Pole, and Greenland here, and Bighorn Basin here, Scandinavia. There's a seaway through part of Russia. And the connectivity around this North Atlantic region is probably this is a somewhat older paleogeographic reconstruction. So we actually think that the land connections were more closer than they're shown here. But what we think is happening is that as the PETM warms up, basically we're allowing plants that have a preference for warmer climates to migrate northward, and they're migrating past this position that we're observing in the Bighorn Basin. So these are the immigrants that show up during the PETM, and at the same time we're losing the kinds of plants that were here before that were adapted to a cooler climate and perhaps a wetter climate. During the very warmest part of the PETM, it's pretty clear that plants are moving around the circumarctic region. So they're getting from North America to Europe and Europe to North America, and the same with East Asia. So, this is what accounts for the plants that show up in the Bighorn Basin as the event is waning. So so you basically have species that are maybe hopping from Europe to Greenland to North America during the warmest time, and then as the event cools, they're moving southward into places like the Bighorn Basin that were probably too hot for them to persist in during the warmest time. So we're seeing really migration of plant species at a global scale. So we're still trying to sort of fill in this picture of what happens in the Bighorn Basin now. And one of the new directions that we're taking is to try to reconstruct the density of the forest canopy. And this is a really difficult thing to do. You know, when we find fossil leaves, we don't find them on the trees. We don't find trees at all. We just find leaves or we find pollen grains. But some of my clever colleagues have worked out that there are correlations between the epidermal cells on leaves and the light environment that those leaves grew in. And basically, every plant has a waxy coating on its leaves, and the waxy coatings preserve as fossils. So we can actually tell the shapes of the surface cells of leaves that were growing 56 million years ago. And in the modern day, you can measure these. And so the cells for some are relatively round, the cells for others are relatively undulatory and elongated. And it turns out that this sort of small round cells are typical of more open habitats, and the complicated cells like this are typical of more closed habitats. And so what we're trying to do, and just beginning this project, is to use fossils of leaf epidermis to see where we are on this spectrum. And the first results show that during the late Paleocene, we're in a forest with a light environment kind of like that during the PETM, we only have one sample so far, the forest opens up, and that afterwards it's even denser than it was before. So we're seeing changes in the canopy, aside from the changes in the species, we're seeing these changes in the canopy of the forest, a much more open forest. Another direction that we've taken in the past, this is with my colleague Ellen Carano at University of Wyoming, is to try to study the next trophic level up. So, plants get eaten by insects, and one of the amazing things about the fossil record here is that we have preserved bug bites. So we know these holes in this leaf were made when the leaf was on the tree, because the leaf made the scar tissue around the edge of that hole. So that had to happen when it was still on the tree, and then the leaf fell into the sediment and was preserved. And what Ellen did was to basically look at the diversity and abundance of bite marks on fossil leaves through this period of time. This is a really cool fossil. This is actually a mine where some kind of moth probably laid an egg here, and the larva mined its way through the tunnel, kept getting bigger and bigger. If you look at this with a microscope, you can actually see the fossilized pellets of poop in the leaf mine. And the reason it's getting wider is because the larva, the caterpillar, is getting bigger. So she looked at these various kinds of damage, and she found out that the period of time in the whole record of 5 or 6 million years when the insects are doing the most damage to the plants is during the PETM. So the warmest time is also the time when the herbivory increased. So this is just a way of summarizing what I've been talking about, and it's done in the form of this lovely reconstruction by an artist named Aldo Chiappi, showing the last part of the Paleocene, the PETM, which we envision to be more open and to have much more tropical look to it, and then the early part of the Eocene immediately after, where it becomes wetter again. So what we see is that many of these warm temperate types of plants are locally wiped out. They're extirpated here in the Bighorn Basin. A lot of tropical species move into the Bighorn Basin, and it doesn't take very long. The very lowest samples we have from the PETM already have all of these tropical plants in them. The forests open up, insects feasted on plants in a really vigorous way. But at the end of the PETM, as the climate cooled, many of those warm temperate species of plants came back. So some of them did go extinct, others didn't go extinct. And so what had happened all those years before when I couldn't find the PETM was that I was looking before and after, but not during. So the floras that exist here in the early Eocene are not so different from the ones that are here in the Paleocene, because a lot of those plants come back. So one of the big mysteries is how do they get through this period of rapid climate change? Where do they survive? And I think the secret may turn out to be in the uplifts around the border of the basin. So there's a lot of topography here, even in the early Eocene, and it could be that some of these are surviving up there. So what do we do with this kind of geologic record? I hope I've persuaded you that, you probably didn't need persuading, that the Bighorn Basin is absolutely the best place in the world to, it's probably the best place in the world to do paleontology. It's certainly the best place in the world to study these kinds of climatic events on land. But how do we use the geologic past to help us understand the future? And let me just go back briefly to this slide, because I want to, of course, we've got a bunch of projections of the future. And part of the reason that there's so much of a range of projections of how much warming there's going to be has to do with we don't know how much carbon dioxide we're going to emit. But part of the range, these lines are actually based on a single scenario, but there's a huge spread around them. And that reflects our uncertainty as Earth scientists of how much warming does a given amount of CO2 cause. We know it causes warming, but we don't really know the full nature of the effects of a given amount of CO2. And the way we try to understand and make these predictions of the future is by doing Earth system modeling. So, unbelievably complex models that include information about the processes that control the flow of carbon from the ocean to the atmosphere to the terrestrial biosphere, that try to calculate the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. So they're extremely complicated models based on basic physics and chemistry, and we make these models in order to predict the future. But how do we test the models? How do we know how good they are? Is really a very big question for everyone, not just for Earth scientists. And really the best way to test the models is by testing them in the past, because we know in the past that these kinds of climate change occurred, and so we have to ask ourselves how well do the simulations that are run in computers reproduce the conditions of the past. And this is another direction of research, is to these are maps, not of data. These are maps that are produced from those computer simulations for the Eocene. So these are paleoclimatic reconstructions, and these red dots, which you can't read, are just to indicate they're places where we have data about what the climate would have been like. So we're in the process of trying to make comparisons between the fossil evidence for climate and the computer simulations of climate 56 million years ago, so that we can have a way of testing how well these climate models work. So that's, I think, a really important lesson, and a really fascinating thing that makes the Bighorn Basin even more important is it's not just that the fossil record is really cool, and it's not just that you have the best one here, but that there's kind of a global resource represented by the fossils and the geology of the Bighorn Basin that has a really important implication for predicting the future as well as for understanding the past. So I want to just close by putting the big take-homes. I already did that. I just want to show this slide here because I kind of want to honor my ancestors. These are all paleobotanists who worked for a substantial amount of time in the Bighorn Basin or on fossils from the Bighorn Basin, beginning with the first paleobotanist ever to work for the Smithsonian and the U.S. Geological Survey, a guy who was wounded twice in the Civil War and then went to work in Washington, describing fossils that he collected or that were collected by the Hayden expedition to Yellowstone in the 1870s or early 80s. And coming up to my advisor, who also did a lot of work in the Bighorn Basin. So I think this is an important place, and I think anyone who lives here or visits here should feel kind of proud and a little bit like they're a piece of something that's has real global significance. So I'm going to leave you with a nice, pretty picture of the Badlands as a time machine. Thanks.